afternoon. Yeah, it's afternoon on the West Coast as well. Yeah. All right. As Tracy mentioned, my name is Taylor Stanek. I am the Managing Director of Policy and Advocacy at the National Endowment for Financial Education. And we are really pleased to be joining FEPP for kind of part two of a conversation that we started last month. Uh, Thanks, Ryan. We're excited to be joining and continuing this conversation. I'll let Hunter introduce himself, and then we can dive into the deck. Our goal here is a presentation, but I just want to name it's going to be a conversation. So even in the introductions here, if you have questions or thoughts, feel free to jump in. But Hunter, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure thing. I'm Hunter Field. I'm a manager of policy and advocacy here at the National Endowment for Financial Education. I had the pleasure of having the chance to speak with a few folks on this call, so it's nice to see you all and appreciate you all giving us the chance to speak with you again today. I've been with NEFE for just over 2 years now, and a lot of that work has been focused on the K through 12 space, most recently on implementation. And that's really what we're going to be focusing on for this conversation today. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to getting into it with you all. And if you do have any questions, I think we should have some time for those as well. So, yeah.
Perfect. And she's on the slide here. I'll make apologies. Beth Bean, our Senior Vice President who oversees our research and policy function, may hopefully be joining us in a few minutes. She got pulled into a separate meeting, so you may be stuck with me and with Hunter, but we'll do our best to rep for her as well as we can. Um, so there are kind of three objectives that the NEFE team has coming into these conversations with FEPP. This is part of the conversation we started last month, really eager to continue it today. And as we thought about how best to use our time with you all, especially recognizing the way in which NEFE has positioned our policy and advocacy agenda within the K-12 space, there are three things we're hoping that this group can walk away from with our conversation today. The first is we want to make sure, to the best of our ability, that we and the folks here at FEPP feel aligned on understanding kind of the state of financial education in the state of Washington today, as well as how it compares to the broader state of K-12 financial education efforts nationwide. So really making sure we have a good understanding of your perspective of the work that you all have done, as well as we're valuable sharing our kind of national lens and national perspective to help inform the way FEPP thinks about your work at the state level. Another thing that we're hoping to do today that I feel like is really easy to do because of the work that FEPP does every day is highlight just how strong a position Washington State is in terms of K-12 financial education today, especially in light of the possibility of a financial education high school graduation requirement coming down the pike from your legislature sometime in the near future. So want to celebrate that success, reflect on that strong foundation, and then think about how that strong foundation and what you all have accomplished already might inform where you go from here, both in terms of a potential high school graduation requirement, as well as in just thinking about how financial education for K-12 students can continue to be enhanced agnostic of that legislation, and thinking about just continuous opportunities for improvement and where we see opportunity for Washington to continue to invest in and build on that strong foundation. And part of how we hope to do that today is by sharing some insights we've gleaned from our work more nationwide, in particular thinking about how other states, especially those who are pursuing the graduation requirement, but even some who have not, what the lessons learned from their experiences might mean for how FEPP can think about how you all continue to chart your path forward. So eager to see at the end if we come out of that. But before we dive into the details, for those of you who have not had the chance to meet us yet, a little bit about NEFE. We are a private operating foundation. We are based in Denver, Colorado, and we strive to be the leading voice in financial education through research, policy, and advocacy. So we do that through funding and conducting research into best practices around effective financial education. That means spending our time trying to understand what in the financial education space works, what does not work, who is it working for, whose needs are not being met, and then using that research to underpin all of our broader activities in the policy and advocacy space, where we spend time thinking about how to drive the policy conversation forward, especially in the K-12 space, but also thinking about how we use that research to help convene the field, financial education professionals, researchers, academics, advocates, practitioners, and drive the work of the broader field forward, as well as ensure that we're creating a centralized vision for where that financial education field wants to go. One thing I will note is that NEFE as a private, excuse me, as a private operating foundation cannot lobby on specific legislation. So we will absolutely be happy to talk about the potential implications of the legislation that the state legislature is considering in Washington. But just want to name, we take no formal position on any given bill. Our goal is to present to you all and to those in this, the other advocates and stakeholders we work with, kind of the unbiased, data-backed best practices that we, as a research and advocacy organization, have identified. And Hunter was just about to pull up the slide, which I think will touch on kind of our core policy agenda topic and issue for the last couple of years, which is K-12 financial education. So as NEFE has over the last few years shifted from being a curriculum provider and a content provider, which many of you may know we used to be, towards this new research and advocacy think tank model, we have chosen to focus our first couple of years on this K-12 financial education conversation and thinking about how we can drive the conversation nationally and at the individual state level forward around requiring financial education in the K-12 system. So where are we today? As of 2025, we see 30 states across the country that have adopted a standalone high school graduation requirement for personal finance. And when we say that, we mean a standalone semester equivalent, so at least a half a credit course that's either a standalone course for a semester or is a semester equivalent embedded in a year-long course. In addition to those 30 states, we see another 7 states that have a partial requirement, meaning that some element of personal finance is embedded in another required course that students must complete for high school graduation. And then the remainder of the states, obviously including Washington, do not have either that full or partial requirement in place, but it's always worth naming that obviously doesn't mean there's not work happening to drive personal finance education forward in those states. You all know as well as anybody the work that Washington's doing. But as NEFE continues to think about this policy topic and this policy agenda, we are going to continue to push for the idea of a high school graduation requirement because we know, and the data and the research tell us, that it is one of the most effective ways to both ensure that personal finance is being offered in every school and every district in the state. And we know that when personal finance is offered, for example, as an elective, students of color, female students, many students in marginalized communities are far less likely to take advantage of those courses. So we know that the high school graduation requirement is a way to drive equitable access to personal finance for all students. So as we dig into the details today, we want to celebrate everything that Washington is doing and also continue to keep our eye on the ball in terms of how we think that that graduation requirement can and should continue to be a part of the conversation. And so before I hand it over to Hunter to start talking about the like actually substantive what of the work that's going on the ground, I want to take just a quick moment to level set on where Washington stands today in terms of kind of NEFE's and our partners' evaluation according to that high school graduation standard requirement. So some of you may be familiar with our partners at the Champlain College Center for Financial Literacy, John Pelletier. We support and sponsor his semi-annual, about every 3-year, report card that he and the Champlain College team put out, evaluating personal finance requirements across the states. In the context of his report, a grade A state, a state that earns an A grade, is a state that requires that full standalone semester equivalent personal financial education course. And there are some D's and F's states where those states literally have no standards. They have nothing in place. There are no requirements of any kind. And Washington falls kind of in the middle at the moment. You do not yet have that personal finance graduation requirement, but you all do, as you know, have standards in place that define what good personal finance education in the state looks like. Obviously, those standards are under review, and that's part of the ongoing Future Ready conversation. We also know that Washington has worked hard to ensure that students in the grades 9 to 12 have access to financial education, though they do not yet have the obligation to take it. So as we talk about this and as we look at some of the other states, we'll use that Champlain College grading system just as a useful kind of shorthand for thinking about those states that have nothing, those states that have a strong foundation but don't yet have that requirement. and states who have that fully implemented or are working towards that fully implemented requirement. That was a lot. I think I just talked for like 6 minutes straight. Before I hand it over to Hunter, and he's going to start talking about the implementation piece of this work, I want to just pause. Any questions, thoughts from the team on kind of the context within which we're hoping to have this conversation?
Taylor, I'm Representative Monica Stonier. I chair the FEPP team here, structured in our legislation for members of each of the majority chambers to have membership on this team. But I have the privilege of being the chair, so I wanted to introduce myself and say hello and thank you for weighing in here. I think this is incredibly helpful for us as we're looking at our policy goals in the legislature, on one hand, and then of course on the other hand, what could implementation look like in the meantime, as a result of when we're talking about folks in the field supporting kids in their learning in this area. So just wanted to
Oh,
take a moment in case I'm not around and my computer dies before we get to the next portion with Hunter. Wanted to make sure I said hello to both of you.
thank you, Representative Stone. You really appreciate it and thrilled to be here. Any other thoughts, questions? Anybody want to dig more deeply into this before we talk about the implementation side? Cool. Now let me kick it over to Hunter with the kind of tee up of we all know that passing a bill, implementing a requirement, or even just deciding as a state that personal finance is a priority is just the first step. How you go about doing it is equally, if not more important than deciding to do it in the first place. So with that, Hunter, take it away, sir.
Thanks, Taylor. Yes, and we'll talk about this a little bit. Thinking about the report card specifically, I mean, Taylor outlined the threshold for certain grades, and I think understanding from a policy lens that we are advocating for a full standalone requirement is kind of the context behind that. But as Taylor said, we know that on the ground it's much more nuanced, and we also, I have a good sense that there are states with full requirements where the offerings might not even be on par with Washington, just with all the work that FEPP has been able to do. The funding model is unique, and it's something that NEFE has held up previously with an award at our 2024 summit. So again, the work that you all are doing, we do want to recognize that, and we also recognize the C grade does not tell the full picture here. Um, Thinking about implementation and in the context of whether or not a graduation requirement will be passed in Washington in the near future, this does not get implemented overnight, right? We know that there is a timeline that most states will put out for themselves, recognizing that it's going to take some work to actually roll this out into schools, especially those that haven't already taken steps to have strong personal finance education. And so typically state standards will be adopted or revised by a state after they pass a requirement. Of course, in Washington, you all are already doing that. Most states do already have some sort of personal finance standards on the books now, typically along the lines of the national standards. So adopting, we aren't seeing as much now. It's mostly revisions when these requirements will be passed. The understanding that we want to make sure that the standards are aligned with the goals that we're looking to accomplish with this new legislation. And so typically that'll be about a year is what we've seen. And after that, it's really about operationalizing this requirement at the individual district and school level. And so a lot of states will take about 2 to 4 years for this part of the process, putting the timeline around 3 to 5 years in total. And so this can vary. I don't think we've seen a ton of rhyme or reason behind some of these timelines. It can just differ. But the bottom line is it's a recognition that this is going to take some time. And typically, teacher training is the first thing that comes up in this conversation. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think when we're thinking about this operationalizing of the requirement, that is a huge component of it. And states recognize that you need to leave time to allow that to happen. And lastly here, one thing that we really are trying to highlight more and more at NEFE when we think about implementation is evaluating these requirements once they are implemented. So if you think of that original 2 to 4, 3 to 5 year implementation timeline, What comes after that? Like that is the initial implementation, but we know that the requirement is not going to be like the most effective right after that, right? We do have research that shows that years after implementation, it becomes stronger. It stands to reason why. Everyone gets a little bit better at what they're doing with this new requirement. And so evaluation is something that is often overlooked as states embark on this journey, in part because I think they recognize it is a sizable task. But we don't want to lose track of that when we're thinking about this, because if evaluation is not being conducted on professional development, but also just knowledge gains for students, then how are we supposed to improve, right? That this can give us insight into areas for improvement, and we're really trying to make sure that this is highlighted. I will just take a moment to plug a couple of webinars that we did in this past fall. The first one actually had Milady as a guest on it. We were honored to have her on, and I think she was able to share some really important insights. This was focused on teacher training and curriculum. I think that's a strong one to start with. And the second webinar we had was focused a little more on partnerships and evaluation. Partnerships, of course, everyone in FEPP, I think, again, very unique and exemplary example that you all have there in Washington. So for anyone who's curious, these are about an hour each, and would recommend if you're looking for some more information, we have those on our YouTube channel. And so those webinars that I mentioned were based off a series of position papers that NEFE published back in spring of 2025. And so these papers were focused on 4 topics that had come up repeatedly in our conversations with the field. We did some initial discovery. We recognized implementation was an area where there could be a little more guidance, even though every state is different and the conditions on the ground are rarely the same. These same topics came up repeatedly. And like I mentioned, teacher training, professional development was really the first one across all of these conversations. But these other 3 topics, again, these are the foundation of the webinars that we published. They came to focus, and these papers look at a number of states that have completed implementation already, and give some examples of the challenges that they faced in each area and creative solutions that they found as well. Washington was not a state of focus in these papers. However, when we were looking at partnerships and collaboration, we had to point to FEPP, because it really is just a unique model. And I think we would love to see more bodies similar to this across the country. And so that's something, why we think it's so important to elevate your work. And we wrote a little bit more about that with a quote from Tracy in that paper as well, if you're curious. So, and these are all available for free on our website. And we can send some links as well for you all. So thinking about each of these papers and where Washington fits in here with the current situation on the ground, right? Teacher training and professional development in some states, and I'll talk a little bit about this, it does differ. Like some states are ahead of the 8 ball in terms of having teachers prepared and the number of districts that are offering this personal finance education. Other states are far from that. And so they are looking to cover all this ground, preparing teachers in short notice, sometimes on the shorter end of that timeline, the window that I mentioned. FEPP is already very, you have helped to lay the foundation for so much of this work already. And I know that this is ongoing too with the financial education grant opportunity that FEPP is still doing, I think, through the end of this year or through next year, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. But the point being, right, the work that you all have done to help prepare teachers is already laying a very solid foundation for if a graduation requirement was to come about. Curriculum and resources, one thing that we've heard all the time, and this we touch on in the paper, is there's just so much noise around what's out there. It's part of why NEFE pivoted away from programs, is because there were so many free programs available. And so things like curating resources, which FEPP has also led in Washington, is incredibly helpful for teachers. And I will also just say, for one of the webinars, we had a question from the audience asking about Spanish-speaking resources, and we pointed them to the OSPI repository that you all have put together. And so I think that just speaks to the fact that, like, even folks in other states who are doing this work, there's not always such a wealth of curated resources for them. And so again, just ahead of the curve in Washington, Washington in that sense. And obviously the standards revision, right? If you're taking care of that right now, it's not even really something you need to worry about immediately after a requirement passed. Partnerships, I touched on a little bit already, and I think I don't need to tell you all about what you're doing on that front, but again, just exemplary and something that NEFE has held up to our national audience and partners. Um, and lastly, evaluation feedback. Of course, there's not a requirement in place to evaluate at the moment, but I think the standard review process speaks to the way that you all are thinking about this systemic way of evaluating what exists and working to improve upon that. So we do know from research that a standalone K through 12 graduation requirement is the most direct way to ensure equitable access. This actually came up recently, some research from Western Washington University that was looking at standalone versus embedded requirements and actually found that the difference was not as extreme. It was largely attributed to teacher preparedness. Now, that is contradicted by some other research, including newly released research that does show that a standalone requirement is more impactful. But I think more than anything, it just speaks to the fact that preparing teachers is that important. And so we do very strongly advocate for a standalone requirement because we have this additional research. But the Western Washington study, I mean, clearly highlights the impact that a well-trained teacher can have on the delivery. And I think, of course, like I've said a little bit here, Washington is uniquely positioned. And I think there's one state that comes to mind that was well positioned for a requirement when it came about, and it ended up putting them in a very good position when that initial implementation was completed. So really quickly, I do want to just show you all this because we mentioned 30 states had passed requirements as of 2025. This implementation timeline kind of paints a picture that while 30 states have passed, most of them are still going through implementation, and it's going to take a few years before they actually have those first graduating classes going all the way through high school. And so just to that point, I think all of these states are going to be grappling with some of the issues that I've spoken about. Many of them are even behind where Washington is just because of the work of FEPPP, which again is very unique across this landscape. So just wanted to provide a little extra context here. Those 30 states have passed these laws, but they are not effective in a true sense. I want to take a few minutes here to look at a few state examples. The first one that I want to point to is Mississippi. And of course, I mentioned, I just want to reiterate that no states are one-to-one examples to each other. Mississippi and Washington have many differences, but just in the context of implementation here, right? So Mississippi was unique. Their requirement came about through regulatory action during the pandemic, which again, like we haven't really seen that anywhere else. And I think during the pandemic says something to that as well. And they had a shorter implementation timeline in part because of that. So their requirement went into place in just a couple of years. And one thing that we heard from our conversations with folks across the state is that there was a concern with this short implementation timeline that they were going to have teachers prepared in time, right? 2 years is a very quick turnaround, especially when the foundation you're building from is maybe not as strong. And so because of that, there was a compromise that basically any licensed teacher in the state, regardless of professional development or even their history, like what they're licensed to teach, it was basically just any licensed teacher in the state could teach this course. And so, what we heard was kind of a mix from folks in Mississippi where, yes, this allowed us to actually get it taught in classes where otherwise, like if there were requirements on professional development, we might not have reached that in 2 years. But the flip side there is that even though Mississippi has very strong professional development offered, they had no guarantees that teachers had been through it. And so really, in terms of accountability and the history of training for teachers who were rolling this out in the classroom, it was a very mixed bag. And I think we heard a little bit of regret on that front, just in terms of the initial implementation. And, just one point here, right? Mississippi does have an A grade in the report card from Champlain. This is because they do have the standalone requirement. But again, all the details I just laid out show the delivery on the ground can differ for states with an A grade too. Pennsylvania is a state that more recently passed a requirement. They are still moving through implementation right now. We actually just had a call recently with someone in Pennsylvania who is working on teacher training and professional development. And something that we've heard, not just in that conversation, but in previous ones, is that spring 2026, this upcoming spring, is a real tipping point in terms of districts and schools being prepared for these new expectations from the state. And there has been a lag there. I think districts, schools obviously focused on the current school year and making sure that they're staying in compliance with what currently exists. And while there are pockets that are well prepared for this new requirement, we are seeing a lag, and I guess you could say a bit of procrastination in other areas of the state where it's just not as immediate. And there is some concern that once we get to spring 2026, there's going to be a bit of scrambling here in spite of a lot of efforts on professional development. So again, this just goes to speak to the fact that Pennsylvania, a state that has many differences again with Washington, their foundation across a large state serving many students was not quite as strong as it could have been with teacher training, and we're just seeing a slight lag in the pickup of this professional development. The state that I mentioned earlier that was really interesting in terms of the foundation was Nebraska. And so Nebraska, again, different just as all these states are from Washington, it does have an A grade for the 2024 class, which was the first one to have the requirement in effect. But from our conversations with Dr. Davidson, who leads Nebraska's Council on Economic Education, she had done a sort of landscape assessment that found that 60% of districts had already been offering personal finance before the requirement was passed. And so when we were talking with her, she was basically the only person who said that they were able to meet the demand of teachers with professional development on a short window. In just the first few years, they had these professional development sessions built out, and they were able to train teachers at a rate that kept up with the demand and got to a point where, they feel pretty confident that there are prepared teachers in basically every district across the state. But again, I think it's a real challenge to reach that threshold without that 60% in advance of the requirement. And I think when we think about Washington and the work that you all have done without a requirement being passed, I see a resemblance there. And I think it just goes to emphasize how important the work you all are doing right now, even without a requirement having passed through the state legislature. The last state that I will talk a little bit about here is Delaware. This is mainly to highlight a sort of disconnect that there was between the state legislature and the reality on the ground in schools across the state. There essentially was a requirement in Delaware, not a graduation requirement, but that personal finance, that financial literacy instruction was being offered in every school. And so the legislature was hearing some, mixed feedback on this. They were getting pushed on a full graduation requirement. They said, well, we basically already do this in our mind. So we're going to issue a report. We're going to see what the status is on the ground before we pass any sort of requirement. And this report that came back found that out of 124 LEAs K through 12, and this is kind of a mixed bag, K through 5, 6 through 8, high school. But they found that across all those grade levels, only 10 of the LEAs, or 8%, were teaching financial literacy with curriculum that was aligned with the grade-specific standards. And this was pretty striking to the legislature. I think it made the case for a full requirement that much easier, and they moved on it incredibly quickly when this report came back. It was basically just, a report that was showing that what they thought was happening was not without this full requirement in place. And so Delaware became the 30th state this past October to sign that bill into law. So, yeah, Taylor, I think, do you want to cover a few takeaways?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think we'll wrap it up, and then we'll want to kick over and see what questions or conversation folks want to have. You've seen all of these points, so I won't belabor them. But as we think about what FEP might take away from these conversations, especially in kind of reflecting what other states have gone through or are currently experiencing, we would continue to encourage you all, especially the legislators on the call, to make sure and think about both time and resources behind implementation of either a full graduation requirement or even the revised standards that we expect Washington will be putting out in the near future, making sure that the timing and the resourcing and the approach to that implementation is intentional, because that intentionality is key to making sure that that implementation is effective versus as we saw in states where it's done very, very quickly or it's done kind of on the fly, and that doesn't necessarily result in really strong outcomes. Um, we would continue to encourage FEP to think about and want to continue to serve as a partner in finding solutions to teacher training and making sure that teachers are equipped both for the current standards and the current situation in Washington, as well as thinking about, again, that requirement. I name, that adoption piece is really important, and I name it within the context of evaluation. But I want to just touch on that just a little bit more, which is that the passage of a bill or the implementation of standards is the first step, but district and school level compliance and then the effectiveness of that compliance is an ongoing opportunity for evaluation. And so, to put it kind of bluntly for the FEP folks, I would encourage you all to be thinking about how you can ensure not only that the standards that you all put out are the highest quality and meet the needs of your students, but how you can ensure that districts and schools are actually abiding by them. And this becomes even more important when it becomes a graduation requirement, if and when. And it's not to say that we want to catch districts or individual schools and shame them. The reality is they're dealing with massive resource constraints. They're dealing with competing priorities. We've also found in many states just the dissemination of guidance from the State Department of Ed can mean that some schools don't understand the requirement or what they're supposed to be doing. But so that, evaluation certainly does mean making sure that teachers are equipped to understand whether the students are achieving the learning outcomes that the standards require. But evaluation also means continued evaluation of the system to ensure that the system is delivering what is being asked of it. And last, we've said it about 19 million times on this call, but want to name part of why we're so excited to be chatting with you all is FEP is so unique. Washington is so lucky to have you all. You all are really starting from the third base when it comes to thinking about how to implement this work. And so it's just about how do you build on that foundation, not how do you kind of start from square one. So happy to share more. We have other states we can highlight if folks want additional examples. We have plenty of additional research we're happy to share. I'm curious to just open it up now either for questions, comments, follow-ups folks might be interested in exploring.
What people are forming their thoughts, I want to share. Representative Stonier's regrets that she had to pop off early to go to her next meeting, and she wanted to be sure that you knew. She is apologizing for having to step out, but she's grateful for your willingness to be here today, as I am. And I do want to make it clear, like FEPP, the FEPP team might be the face of FEPP when we're going forward, but really FEPP is everybody that's on this call today. And there's no way we could do the work that we're doing without the support of our national partners like NEFE, and with Andrew being here today, he has been a tremendous support. But also, Taylor, I just have to say it's just flattering that you're continuing to share the work that we're doing with the work that you do across the nation, and continue to give us these compliments about the unique approach that we do. And I just am grateful for all the support we have from everybody here today. So with that, is anybody have an opportunity to pop in a question, please do. I'd like to ask if Hunter or Taylor, could you share your slide deck with me and I'll send it out to people that were here or were not here? And also, if you have a link to those white papers, I'm happy to make sure people have an opportunity to find those too. I was digging on your website and I don't know where they are.
We'll send them over to you. And yeah, forgive me, Tracy, if I hadn't been editing the deck 2 minutes before we hopped on, I would have sent it to you in advance. So
we really appreciate your ability to be here and willingness to present to us again. That's a lot of time you've donated for us. Surely Bobby has a question.
Hi, Hunter and Taylor. Nice to see you guys
again.
Hey,
Bobby. Nice to see you again.
Hey, guys. Thank you. Just a quick question. I love the stuff that you shared with us about the importance of compliance and evaluation. Do you have models of where that's been done effectively? Tracy and I were just talking about those particular pieces. Obviously, in a place that has local control, we have so many different school districts that are available. And there's a lot of different regulatory issues. Who's in charge of what at the state level? Washington deals with those same issues. So what are examples that maybe us of where that has been effective because we can send out, have you done X? A district will, whoever there fills it out, says that yes, we have. We've met that
Of
standard.
course.
So
Yeah.
what are some models that we can look at that would help refine us as we move towards a graduation requirement?
Yeah, so I think, Bobby, it's a really, really exciting and interesting question. And frankly, I think it's one where I would not say that there is there are maybe one or two examples of strong ongoing kind of monitoring and compliance. I think Utah probably is one of the most one I would readily point to because they've been doing this for 20 plus years. I think they have more of this mechanism in place. I think they're also a great example. We should probably have a slide highlighting them of the way in which that ongoing evaluation has led to subsequent legislation and change. So throughout study, the state auditor actually did an audit of the requirement in 2018. That prompted additional legislation around student level evaluation and compliance. They've passed subsequent legislation on teacher certification and things. So Utah's one. I think Delaware's study that prompted their legislation is an example of the way in which the state can engage in a kind of one-time review to understand what's happening. Interestingly, Maine is following Delaware's path. They opted, rather than passing a requirement this year, they've similarly commissioned a study to find out to what extent personal finance is already being offered. And we're curious to see if this plays out similarly in that state. Beyond that, I think I'm happy. There are one or two pieces of research that we can share where researchers, for example, have gone in and done course code or curriculum audits to try to understand to what extent individual schools and districts are complying with their state's requirements. But the reality is, beyond probably Utah, which even they don't have an ongoing kind of formalized mechanism, they've just done it a few times in spot checky ways. This is an area where we think that there is a sizable opportunity for virtually everybody to be thinking about this much more intentionally than they have been. That evaluation piece has not traditionally been baked into the legislation that's required and is not necessarily a muscle that the state departments of education or the state boards of education are building for this requirement. And to your point, where we do see it, it's the districts submit their annual reporting to the state and somebody in the district administration office checks the box that says, yes, we're doing this, but that may not be reflective of the reality on the ground in the individual schools in the district. So I think it's an ongoing challenge. And I think it's a place where we're eager to work with states to see if there are ways to do this better, because I don't think anybody's doing it particularly well. Hunter, I don't know if you have anything else you would offer.
The only other thing I'd add, I do think Utah with the audit and what came out of that is a good example. We've also heard just anecdotally from teachers and other people in the state that like there is more that can be done and that the evaluation is ongoing. And so I think that's an important part to understand about it as well. And thinking back to the slide I showed with the implementation timelines of different states that had passed requirements, one of those states that did have its first graduating class last year was Rhode Island. And part of Rhode Island's legislation did include a piece about a report that was to be issued. And as far as I know, I haven't seen that report yet. And so I think it does highlight, like, even when it is codified in the legislation, this is going to be a challenge. And so to Taylor's point, thinking about it and thinking about creative solutions is something that we're working to do as well. There unfortunately just aren't a ton of great examples to point to. But yeah, just wanted to add that.
Yeah, that's a great call out. The Rhode Island study is a good point. Yeah, I think it's at least a year overdue, I believe.
Oh my gosh. We're almost at time, but I do want to just wrap up with one point. It's like, even though we have a FEPP that's over 20 years old, as other states might be looking at forming something like that. As you know, I've been working with California for the last 2 or 3 or maybe 4 years. It's still the challenge we have is getting the word out that we exist and the support that we have. And even after all these years and going on 4 years with this bigger team and all the materials that we've had the opportunity to review and curate, it's still a challenge. And so I think that's something I'd like to start prioritizing over the next year, just figuring out how do we get in the rooms of people to know the support is already here. I think that would help build the advocacy and the understanding that this isn't the big scary lift that a lot of people think it is. They just don't know what's already out there. So with
Totally.
that, if you two don't mind staying around, I want to honor just to close the meeting and adjourn it on behalf of Representative Stonier. But if you don't mind sticking around for people that maybe didn't, we just try to respect people's time to get them out on time. And
Yep.
I'd like to thank each and every one of you and wishing you the happiest of holidays. And thank you publicly to the two of you for the time you've invested in us. And I'm
Not at
happy
all.
to stick around for a few extra questions.
Yeah, we
And we'll
talked a
call
lot. So
them.
we're also happy to follow up with folks individually. If
Okay.
anybody wants to reach out to us, you're more than welcome to,
Yeah,
but happy to
we'll
hang
make
for a
sure
minute.
we share your email addresses with them. And so for the purpose of the minutes, we'll call the meeting adjourned at 1:01. Thank you, everybody.